our guest tonight as we speak about the situation in Ukraine, and in particular, the potential for a resolution of that conflict, a stalemate, or an escalation, including the possibility of broader escalation to spread the war beyond Ukraine. Our guest is George Beebe, who is the Director of Grand Strategy at the Quincy Institute. He spent more than 2 decades in government as an intelligence analyst, diplomat, and policy advisor, including as director of the CIA's Russia analysis and as a staff advisor on Russia matters to Vice President Dick Cheney. His book, The Russia Trap: How Our Shadow War with Russia Could Spiral into Nuclear Catastrophe, warned how the United States and Russia could stumble into a dangerous military confrontation. And I have to say, it's quite a good book, and it's very well written. It's a good flow. It's an easy read. But welcome, George. And just to kick things off, I'd like to ask about kind of the current situation militarily in Ukraine, the overall balance. On the one hand, Ukraine defeated this big Russian offensive against Kyiv. They seem to have pushed Russian forces back pretty significantly from around Kharkiv. But then at the same time, in the last few days, they've closed down Mariupol, and they seem to be having some advances behind Severodonetsk that raise risks possibly of encirclement. So how do you assess the current state of the war, and how do you think that might play into the politics and possibilities around bringing the war to a close?
Well, John, first, thank you for the invitation to speak with you tonight. It's an honor to be online with you and your audience. On the question of how the war is going, I will say, first of all, that we all need to bear in mind that that old adage of the fog of war is a very real thing. And the reports that we get about what's happening on the battlefield need to be filtered through that reality that we don't have, I think, a very clear picture of exactly what is going on. There are efforts on both sides of this war to shape perceptions and thereby, affect the decisions of adversaries and their partners and allies in all of this. That said, it's quite clear that the war did not go as quickly or easily as the Russians had originally intended. And I think it's quite telling that the initial invasion force, particularly those forces that were tasked with taking Kyiv and occupying Kyiv, weren't equipped for a long battle or significant resistance in Kyiv. The reports that I've seen indicated that they were equipped with riot control gear, which I think tells you what the Russians actually expected to face on the opposing side of the battlefield. I think they expected the Ukrainians largely to flee, which obviously did not happen. The Russians found themselves in a real contest. Now, the Russians have attempted to regroup. They have refocused their objectives on the Donbass, the southeast, building a land corridor, a land bridge between Russia proper and the Crimea, as well as taking the full Donbass, which Putin has formally recognized the independence of, but which Russian forces on the ground do not fully occupy. Their progress in the East in this newly focused phase of the war is difficult to judge at this point. They certainly are not making rapid gains. But they also seem to be making some progress over time. Whether that will continue or not is an open question. This kind of warfare, I think, is susceptible to breakthrough events on either side. So it's quite conceivable that the Russians could in some way break through the Ukrainian lines, surround, envelop their forces and deal some sort of decisive blow there in Donetsk and Lugansk. But it's also possible that the opposite could occur. And I think the Ukrainians have fought quite courageously, quite wisely, and they've done a good job of taking advantage of the military and intelligence support that they're getting from the United States and our NATO allies. So if I had to forecast where this is going to go right now, I think we're most likely in for a long slog. With no real decisive victory on either side. But, I say that with the caveat of saying there's an awful lot right now that we don't know. And this is not an easy situation to forecast.
Yeah, it makes me think of, the point about the long slog made me think about some remarks yesterday that got a lot of attention in the press. Henry Kissinger was out at the World Economic Forum in Davos and suggested that he made a few arguments. One was that Western powers should not try to humiliate Russia, that the goal of the conflict should be a return to the pre-war status quo, which I read as the borders on February 23rd, and that negotiations should really get going in the next 2 months, or that it's going to be a whole lot harder. And since you were mentioning the long slog there, that seems like that might not be on the table. But I'm curious what you make of those three arguments. Don't humiliate, goal should be the status quo, and negotiate soon.
Well, I agree with Kissinger's remarks, both generally and each of their specific recommendations. I think he's absolutely right that the longer this war goes on, the greater the chances are that this will escalate, both horizontally and vertically. Horizontally, to bring in countries that are not now active participants on the battlefield, meaning Russian strikes against Poland or other NATO member states, or even some sort of Russian attack. And I think the most likely form of that would be in the cyber realm against the United States itself. The other possibility is vertical escalation into, going up the nuclear ladder. Lots of ways that could happen. I don't think the escalation would start with the Russians resorting to the use of nuclear weapons, but it's not hard to imagine how this could get there over time, evolving out of a crisis in which U.S. and Russian forces found themselves in a direct clash of some kind. And I think Kissinger's point that averting that kind of escalation becomes more difficult the longer this war goes on is absolutely correct. It also becomes a more formidable political challenge to wrestle with the kinds of compromises and hard choices that will inevitably be involved in any kind of negotiated settlement. The longer this goes on, the more blood spilled, the more people feel that they have made an enormous investment in all of this, and therefore need some sort of significant payoff from the blood and treasure and prestige that have been put on the line to this point. So I think he's correct. The sooner that we get down to real negotiations, the better. Now that's still quite a formidable challenge, because I think the temptation in the United States is to want to humiliate the Russians, to believe that the challenge that we're facing here is essentially naked aggression, territorial aggrandizement, an effort to rebuild a Tsarist or Soviet type empire. And therefore, our belief is that the way that you must deal with that is through deterrence and punishment, to show the aggressor that not only did this aggression not pay off, but it actually put the aggressor in a worse state than it would have been had the aggression not been initiated. And so there's little appetite right now in the United States for trying to find some sort of compromise way out of the situation. But I think there are two things that we need to keep in mind on this. One is John Kennedy's great lesson that he drew from the Cuban Missile Crisis, when he said that the leaders of nuclear superpowers should not put each other in a position where they have a choice between humiliation and launching nuclear war. I think that was correct back in the Cold War days. That lesson is unchanged today. If we actually seek to humiliate the Russians, to corner Putin, to force him to choose between humiliation and escalation, there's a very good chance that the choice will be escalation. And that's one that will turn all of us into losers, not just the Russians. So it's an issue that I think we need to handle with a great deal of sobriety. The other thing that I think we need to bear in mind is that I believe, and this was actually the subject of my book that you very politely complimented in your introduction, that this war is not so much the product of Putin sitting down sometime in February and saying, gee, I'd really like to have Ukraine part of the Russian Empire once again, but rather the product of a long-term escalatory spiral. A situation in which efforts that the United States and our Western allies have undertaken that we think enhances our security and enhances the stability of Europe have been perceived by the Russians as threatening. And that has produced a cycle of action and reaction that has escalated over time. And this began many, many years ago. And the way you deal with escalatory spirals is different than the way you deal with aggressor states. You know, with Hitler, with Nazi Germany, we all know, you don't appease, you don't seek to find compromises. You respond with resolute firmness and willingness to fight back. And that, causes the aggressor state to look elsewhere for victims, rather than whetting the appetite for further aggression. But with escalatory spirals, the only way out is through dialogue and diplomacy, through introspection, for a willingness to understand the other side's perceptions and to find compromises that can address their perceived security concerns while at the same time not sacrificing your own security interests. That is an approach that we have not really tried with the Russians. And I think Kissinger, while not being so explicit as what I'm suggesting here, is, I think, implying that we need to be recognizing that aspect of this conflict. And that requires a change in how we're attempting to deal with it.
Yeah, so on the escalation dimension, if I could maybe push a little bit, someone might say the Russians might see these incentives to escalate, but a lot of their military forces seem to be committed on the battlefield. They seem to be rolling over to the prospect of Finland and Sweden joining NATO, that nuclear escalation can increase the amount of trouble they're in without really solving a lot of their problems, that they can basically make their own problems bigger, and that they don't have a lot of tools to really escalate in a way that's going to decisively affect outcomes. What would you make of that kind of argument?
Well, I wouldn't dismiss that argument. There's certainly a lot of rationality to that logic. And obviously, so far, the Russians have not escalated. I would point out, however, that as their conventional military weakens, and as they face the prospect of a NATO alliance that is enlarging, bringing in new members with long borders with Russia, that the Russians are not actually capable of countering with their military. They're badly outnumbered, badly outmatched technologically. The likelihood that they're going to rely increasingly on their nuclear arsenal, I think, goes up. I don't think they have a choice. I expect we're going to be in a situation where the Russians will not simply, grimace and swallow Swedish and Finnish membership in NATO, but rather return to a situation that we found problematic back in the early 1980s, when the Russians deployed, the Soviets at the time, deployed SS-20 intermediate range missiles, pointed them at European capitals, and put the European security landscape on a nuclear hair trigger that the United States, countered through the deployment of Pershing II intermediate range missiles in Europe. And this had, obviously quite a disruptive effect on the NATO alliance, and I think reduced our margin for error in dealing with the Soviet Union. And we would be entering that kind of situation today with a major difference relative to the early 1980s. And that is, we have no existing arms control structure to speak of with the Russians that can manage this kind of situation. And very little prospect, given the moribund state of the U.S.-Russian diplomatic dialogue, of reviving one. So, we may well be headed toward a situation where nuclear confrontation becomes more likely, and our means of containing that danger are badly crippled relative to the situation we faced in the Cold War. So would the Russians, consciously make their situation worse, resorting to the use of nuclear weapons under these circumstances? I think they would certainly be quite sober-minded about the potential for getting into a catastrophic situation. But if their backs are against the wall and they feel they have no choice but to resort to some sort of nuclear use, the chances that they do it, are they better than even? Probably not, probably less than even. But given the stakes, the potential consequence of that, a 25, 30% chance that they might resort to nuclear use, that's a very, very serious risk. One that I think the United States has to ask itself, are the rewards of the policies that we're pursuing worth that kind of risk on our part? And my answer to that would be no.
So one of the things that you also wrote about in your 2019 book was the cyber front of this and kind of some potential cyber escalation dynamics. And I'm curious how you would assess the cyber dimension of the current conflict. What's going on, and then kind of in light of some of your previous analysis, what are some things that could make things get worse?
Well, one of the things that's striking about the conflict so far is the relative absence, at least as far as we know publicly, of significant cyber operations as a part of all this. There have been, reports of a few things that have gone on both the Russian and Ukrainian sides here, but no headline-grabbing moves. And as far as I can tell, really not a significant arena in this war to this point. Now, will it remain that way? I don't know, but I think the risk that we're running here is that the United States is using quite formidable economic power and financial leverage to essentially attempt to strangle the Russian economy. Now, the Russians have managed under all of this to cope, I think, relatively well, given the formidable economic warfare that the United States and Europe have unleashed on Russia so far. But if things get significantly worse for the Russian economy over time, the temptation to retaliate against the United States is going to grow. Now, how might the Russians do that? Well, they may play by the rules of the game that we have established so far, attempting to deprive the West of, critical inputs that we need for our economies, strategic minerals and energy and that sort of thing. But the other thing that I think is a real risk over time is that the Russians go after our economic Achilles heel, and that is our dependence on the digital realm. So much of the US and European economy depends on cyber infrastructure that is more or less vulnerable to skilled attackers. There's not much that we can do to prevent it if the Russians really want to go after our digital vulnerabilities and sabotage, supply, inventory control systems, the industrial controls on which our, water supplies and power supplies, electrical grid distribution depend, our GPS timing system that, allows us to conduct credit card transactions, that sort of thing. All of that is highly vulnerable to cyber attack. The Russians are completely capable of going after it. They realize that that sort of thing would be a profound escalatory attack. It would almost certainly elicit a major American counterattack on Russia. But again, if the Russians feel cornered, if this war is going poorly and their economy is really suffering, I think that's the kind of move they could undertake. And where that kind of escalatory step might lead is anybody's guess. But I think once that begins, it would be difficult to control.
So a question we've got from our audience is about going back to kind of NATO, and I think kind of alluding to this long-term escalatory spiral you had referenced. They ask, NATO was already on Russia's border at Estonia and Latvia. So why did Putin not attack those countries if he sees the expansion of NATO as an existential threat? And I might add, and they're right in Petersburg.
Well, the Baltic states are, I think, a fundamentally different case than Ukraine. Ukraine, in the Russian mind, is basically the great Slavic, Russian heartland. Belarus, Ukraine, Russia, that you're talking about the core in most Russian minds of Russian culture. And Ukraine is, a critical part of the Russian economy. There are all sorts of cultural, societal, social links there, enormously important to Russian security. Many of the invasions that the Russians have suffered over the years went right through Ukraine. And strategically, the Russians are, unlike the United States, not protected by, two vast oceans and, benign neighbors to the north and south. Russia is basically a giant plain. And there aren't, geographic barriers to invasion. And the Russians have coped with that situation over the centuries by attempting to put, vast geographic distances between the Russian heartland and potential invaders. And that, I think, applies in spades to their approach to Ukraine. So the prospect of small, non-Slavic Baltic states being a part of the NATO alliance, and particularly a situation in which, for most of the time in which they were in the alliance, the United States did not deploy military forces there or bases on any kind of permanent basis. And in fact, for most of the time that the Balts were in the alliance, The alliance didn't even have a plan for how to defend them, believing that it would never be necessary until one day the Estonians raised their hand and said, we'd feel a lot more comfortable if you actually had military plans for how you would defend us. But I think Ukraine is a fundamentally different situation there.
How does this Russian invasion fear manifest today? Because someone challenging it might say, look, NATO is not all that united. Nobody's really talking about marching into Russia. They have nuclear weapons, which, create powerful incentives against invasion. Is this, what's driving this fear on the?
Well, a couple things. Part of it is that, legacy of invasion that I talked about, and how the Russians have been shaped over the centuries to be more fearful of invasion than your average country, let me say. The second part of this is that the Soviet Union, in recent memory, in the lives of a good number of Russians, and particularly the Russian leadership, broke up. Is gone. That leaves, I think, a very significant amount of psychological baggage. And to tell people that have lived through that, don't worry. You don't need to fear anybody attempting to break up Russia or invade or anything like that. You're just being paranoid, doesn't really, ring true to them, given the traumas from their perspective that they have lived through. And I think the third thing, and something that a lot of people in the West don't get, this argument that NATO is a defensive alliance, Russia need not fear expansion, we have no aggressive intentions, was one that we employed with the Russians in the mid-1990s as we were considering the first round of expansion, and as the Russians, to a man, were saying, bad idea, we don't like this, bad things are going to flow. Please don't do this. Our reaction was, look, this is not an aggressive alliance, it's defensive. We are bringing in new members to encourage reform, to encourage greater civilian control over the military. You're going to wind up with neighbor states that are more stable, less threatening, and more confident in order to have a more constructive relationship with Russia than they would otherwise be if they did not have, the umbrella of NATO alliance protection and the wise reform counsel that we will be providing them over time. Well, the Russians were skeptical, but within weeks of admitting into the alliance, the Czech Republic and Poland and Hungary, what happened? The NATO alliance undertook an out-of-area operation. Where? In Serbia. Why? For things that the Serbians had done outside their borders that were threatening other countries? No. For perceived human rights violations, abuses that were occurring inside Serbia against the Kosovar minority. And the NATO alliance did this without a United Nations Security Council mandate. So the Russians looked at that and said, well, NATO's actions don't seem, from our perspective, to be consistent with these reassurances. What is it that's going to protect Russia from some sort of similar operation by NATO inside Russia itself? For example, if the NATO alliance were to conclude that the Russian government were abusing the human rights of Chechen separatists inside the Russian Federation. Not a hard thing for them to imagine. And what would limit NATO's ability to do that? International law? No. Obviously, NATO was not constrained by United Nations Security Council requirements in launching that war against Serbia then. And would the prospect of changing international borders by force deter the NATO alliance there? No. Obviously, that was the outcome with Kosovo. An independent state was carved out of Serbia, which the United States and much of Europe felt was entirely justified under the circumstances, but which was hardly reassuring to the Russians as they imagined the way this formidable alliance might turn its sights on Russia itself. So this notion that the Russians, are greatly exaggerating the threat that NATO might pose to Russia doesn't really ring true within the Russian elite, given their history and given recent, in their view, NATO out-of-area behaviors.
I've got another question from the audience from Brian, who asks, do you foresee any peace settlement to the current conflict where Crimea returns to Ukraine, or is the Crimea question a complete non-negotiable from a Russian perspective?
I think Crimea is completely non-negotiable from the Russian perspective. They consider this, at this point, Russian territory. And I think they will defend it with nuclear weapons if necessary. And I'm aware of several significant Russian figures who have said so explicitly in private conversations, that Crimea is Russian territory. We have nuclear weapons to defend Russian territory. And if necessary, that is a scenario in which we would use them.
So we've got a couple of questions from our audience about the other side, about the Ukrainian side here. One, Stuart asks, if the West wishes to encourage Ukraine to enter negotiations with Russia that might lead to territorial losses, is the only leverage the West can use throttling back supplies to Ukraine? And would there be sufficient agreement among Western nations to do something like this? And then another audience member asks whether Zelensky could convince Ukrainians to accept neutrality or perhaps to give up.
Well, on the question of neutrality, Zelensky has already come out and said that Ukraine is willing to accept strategic neutrality, with the proviso that that neutrality is guaranteed with some kind of binding security assurances. Now, the devil is in the details on that, because it's quite possible that what Ukraine has in mind is some sort of Article 5 type security guarantee without any of the other obligations to NATO that would accompany formal membership for Ukraine in the alliance. I doubt that that's a situation that would be acceptable to the United States or many other NATO allies. And it certainly wouldn't be acceptable to the Russians. Whether or not strategic neutrality is a practical possibility for Ukraine under these circumstances, I think is an open question. Now, the question of territorial concessions and to what degree the United States could use its leverage over Ukraine to encourage or even coerce the Ukrainians into making some kind of concessions, I think is very problematic. Right now, I think the Ukrainians believe that they are either winning or have serious prospects of being able to win at some point. And that means it's highly unlikely that they're willing to make concessions right now on territory. Moreover, I think Zelensky has a problem on his political right. There are very significant actors in Ukraine that would strongly oppose any negotiations over territory, any territorial concessions. And if Zelensky were to push for them, it might well jeopardize his position. So I think the United States needs to tread very cautiously in encouraging a settlement. That said, some sort of return to the pre-February 24th status quo, in which the Russians essentially leave the question of Ukraine's territorial boundaries open. In other words, you could envision a situation where both Ukraine and Russia were to say, this is an issue that needs to be decided by some sort of internationally monitored referendum of the people in this region itself. Right now, I think the reality is that the people living in the Donbass would not accept Kyiv's rule after all that they've gone through over the last 8 years, and the prospect of this territory actually returning to Kyiv's control is the reality is that that's unlikely. It's also unlikely that the Ukrainians would just bargain this away at a negotiating table. So there needs to be some other formula for finessing this if we're going to reach a political settlement. Right now, I think the prospects of that are very low. I don't see the United States at this point encouraging the Ukrainians to negotiate or to show any flexibility on this. The political winds in Washington are blowing in the direction of seeking strategic victory over the Russians. And that term is not very clearly defined, but I think it clearly means driving the Russian forces out of Ukrainian territory, at least in the Donbass, if not in Crimea, and rendering the Russian military, so impotent that it can't realistically consider this kind of aggression again in the future. That doesn't mean a negotiation. That means a long-term war, and more or less a generational divide between the West and Russia. That we're not going to be able to repair for many, many decades.
Well, sticking with that, one of our questioners asked about the impact of this regarding China. There's been a kind of the long-standing realist dream on some level in America here has been to kind of play the opposite of the Nixon-Kissinger triangle approach and soft align with Russia to balance against China. Is anything like that going to be possible in the future? And then to add on to that, effectively, it seems like our foreign policy right now is prioritizing Europe and Russia over considerations related to East Asia and China. The troops that we send to Europe cannot be sent to the Pacific, for example. Do you think that's the correct?
Well, I think the United States has pursued a quite paradoxical strategy in dealing with Russia and China over the past couple of decades. It has become abundantly clear that China is our biggest geostrategic challenge. China has ascended to the point of being a peer rival of the United States, not just militarily like the Soviet Union was, but economically and technologically. And it is, again, unlike the Soviet Union, which was essentially an autarky economically, China is, deeply interconnected in the world economy, including interconnected in the U.S. economy in ways that make our, containment approach that we employed against the Soviet Union during the Cold War quite impractical for dealing with the rise of Chinese power. I think until fairly recently, it was not possible for the United States to actually drive a wedge between China and Russia. That was unrealistic given Russia's interest in having a stable and beneficial relationship with China. But I think it was possible for us to establish a little bit of strategic distance between China and Russia, not inadvertently encouraging deep military and security cooperation between those two countries directed at the United States. And we have fostered a degree of anti-US cooperation between China and Russia that I think has hurt our interests, and it needn't have happened. And one of the things that I think has led to Putin's blunder in Ukraine, and it's quite clearly a strategic blunder, was his expectation that the US focus on the rise of Chinese power would lead us to seek some sort of accommodation with Russia, some sort of way of stabilizing Russia's relationship with the West so that we could pivot toward China and focus our time and attention on the rise of Chinese power. It didn't work out that way. I think honestly, and I don't know what's going on in Putin's head, but I would imagine that he, is quite perplexed as to why we weren't willing to entertain some sort of compromise over Ukraine that would facilitate that sort of strategic pivot. So my guess is that he's been surprised, not just by the degree to which Ukraine has fought back, not just by the degree to which Ukraine has proved to be a genuine and genuinely capable independent rival of Russia, but I think he's been surprised by the U.S.'s unwillingness to seek some sort of accommodation with the Russians.
Got a follow-up question here from Chris, really about the post-conflict situation in Ukraine, or possibly one that might emerge in the event of a stalemate as well. He says, right now, people in Ukraine have more access to weapons than to food. You have civilians being tossed into armed conflict. You have a lot of people having traumatic experiences. If Ukraine wins or loses, or you might say draws, what type of world will Ukraine enter? Do you think there could be things like warlordism or similar kinds of insecurity that you often see in post-conflict states? Do you think it might be an issue for neighboring countries? I mean, I know a number of folks have talked about how there used to be a thriving black market in weapons in Ukraine, and now it's a country that has a lot of weapons being added to it. What do you think about this kind of post?
Well, I think that's an important question, and it's a very difficult one to answer. We're entering into a situation where the opportunities for strategic independence in Europe seem to be evaporating. Two of the most long-standing and noteworthy independent states, non-aligned states with NATO, look poised to join the alliance. Austria, of course, is a holdout. Switzerland, a few others, not particularly significant. But the viability of independence post-war, non-alignment of Ukraine post-war, I think is a problematic situation. And what the implications of that geostrategic situation for Ukraine will be on its internal stability, on the prospects for rebuilding, recovering from the extensive damage that it has suffered, which is only going to grow worse over time. It's a very difficult question to answer. Another important question is human capital. there's been an enormous degree of human, migration. People internally displaced by the fighting or having, left Ukraine altogether. And how many of those people will return, if and when the fighting stops, is anybody's guess right now. The longer the war goes on, I think, the more likely it is that many of those refugees will opt not to return. They will have started, putting down roots elsewhere, trying to take advantage of opportunities elsewhere. And I don't know how many of them will actually return. That has implications for where Ukraine is going to go over time. Then the final thing I would say is usually, in historic experience, devastating war experiences don't tend to lead toward the development of grassroots democracy and responsible political behavior within agreed rules of the game, where people dispense with win-lose zero-sum thinking, recognize that opposition has a legitimate role to play in the functioning of government, and that people that lose elections can come back and win them in the future, and it's not winner take all forever kind of circumstances. Ukraine is not a democracy right now. It has not been since its independence from the Soviet Union, despite what you hear in a lot of Western public discourse about this. Whether it will become a democracy or not is an open question. I don't think large-scale, quite destructive warfare and essentially civil warfare to a great degree between Ukraine's central and western regions and its eastern and southern regions is going to increase the likelihood that it will evolve in a democratic direction in the future. We shall see. There are very few states of the former Soviet Union that have overcome a long legacy of corruption and government dysfunction. The Baltic states are the primary outliers on that. But I wouldn't put a lot of money on Ukraine, becoming a lot more like Germany or France in the next couple of decades.
I'm curious if you could expand a bit on your statement that Ukraine is not a democracy.
Ukraine is a country that has been plagued by, corrupt post-Soviet patronage politics for as long as it, has been an independent state post-Soviet dissolution. We use the term oligarchs a lot, referring to Russia. And we use that to mean, business tycoons, billionaires that have enriched themselves on the remnants of formerly Soviet state-owned enterprises and property, and really are the power behind the state government and essentially call the shots. That was true of Russia in the 1990s. It is not true now and hasn't been true since the early 2000s, when Putin effectively neutered Russia's oligarchs and made them dependent on Kremlin decisions and largesse, not the other way around. That is not true in Ukraine, has not been true. Oligarchs actually do exercise significant roles behind the scene, a significant amount of economic and political power behind the scenes in Ukraine. It's heavily factionalized. And all of its post-Soviet presidencies have been allied with significant business clans who have operated in, both licit and illicit ways, to exercise power in Ukraine. And they have essentially, from election to election, rotated terms in power. And, clans based in Western and central Ukraine have alternated with Eastern-based clans. But the power behind those governments has really been in those patronage networks. That's not a functioning democracy by, I think, anybody's standards.
So another question about some of these discussions that have been happening recently is about all the grain supply that's being held up in Ukrainian ports. And there has been talk of other militaries coming to escort ships carrying grain out of Ukrainian ports. There's been chatter that maybe the Egyptians might be interested in participating. The British have raised this idea. What do you think about the prospects of that?
Well, it's interesting because the United States has been talking to Russia at lower levels about finding some way to allow for grain shipments from Ukraine out into the international market, just for humanitarian reasons. And my understanding is that the Russians have said, sure, we're willing to do that. But the price for that is that you, again, for humanitarian reasons, need to ease economic sanctions on Russia. And my understanding is, not surprisingly, the United States has said, no, we're not going to ease any economic sanctions on Russia, which, of course, leaves you with other, more coercive options if you want to open those ports. Now, what are the prospects for that? I think it would mean war with Russia. I don't think the Russians would, simply say, gee, we understand your security, your humanitarian concerns, and, we don't want to get into a direct conflict with you. So, the way is open. We understand you're serious. My guess is that this would result in a direct naval confrontation. And where that might go, I don't know. But I think it would be a clear escalation. And it would bring outside players, the United States, if our Navy were involved, or allies or partners, if they're involved, into a direct military confrontation with Russia.
One other worry that I've been hearing lately is that Russia might agree to a deal with Ukraine at some point, in the near to medium term, some kind of ceasefire, and then use the time to rebuild, rearm, maybe reform its military, and then come back and attack again. Of that kind of prospect.
Well, if coming back and attacking again in Ukraine is what that question is getting at, then I think that's completely possible if this war doesn't really end in a negotiated settlement. In fact, I think it would be likely that an unstable line of confrontation in Ukraine would be used by both Ukraine and Russia, to regroup, rebuild, rearm, and, try to seek advantage at some point in the future. If the concern is that the Russians would use some sort of respite in Ukraine, to turn their military prowess, assuming, it were rebuilt in some way, on Poland or the Baltic states or Brussels, I think the chances of that are extremely low. I think, that I would put in the category of threat exaggeration. And I would offer that we ought to recall what happened in Georgia in 2008 when we encounter these arguments that the Russians are really trying to rebuild empire and that they will only stop when met with resolute Western military force. The Russians, responded in Georgia in 2008 to an attack that was initiated by the Georgian side, seeking to recapture separatist territories that had declared independence from Georgia proper. The Russians at that time had deployed peacekeepers on an agreed basis with the Georgian government in those regions. Several of them came under fire and were killed in the initial Georgian attack. Now, this also happened after the Bucharest summit in 2008, at which NATO had declared that Ukraine and Georgia would one day be members of the NATO alliance. So the Russians had a very strong interest, not only in responding forcefully to the Georgian attack, but also delivering a decisive blow to the prospect of Georgian membership in the NATO alliance. And they essentially routed the Georgian military. Now, there were, serious problems with Russia's military performance then, but within, a few weeks, they were on the march from Georgia's separatist territories in the north toward Tbilisi, and there was nothing standing in their way from continuing, overthrowing the Saakashvili government and essentially taking control of Georgia. They did not do that. They actually pulled back, struck a compromise settlement with Georgia, recognized the independence of those separatist territories in South Ossetia and Abkhazia, but did not annex them. Now, what does that tell us? I think it tells us that the notion that the Russians are really driven by empire, by territorial aggrandizement, by reincorporating parts of the old Soviet Union and rebuilding it, don't look particularly, true given that experience. The Russians accomplished a very important strategic goal in Georgia. They prevented Georgia from becoming a clear U.S. vassal state or a member of the NATO alliance, and they stopped having accomplished that. And I would suggest that the notion that the Russians will, continue to try to build the empire in Ukraine and elsewhere, unless we defeat their military now, I think is a dubious assertion.
Well, with that, let's close with one final question. What's one piece of advice that you would give to someone who wants to follow in your footsteps professionally?
Well, if someone wants to enter into this field as, foreign policy analysts, foreign policy wonk of some kind, I would recommend two things. One, build your professional network of contacts. The more people that you build those sort of professional relationships with, the better able you will be able to find and compete for job opportunities as they arise. The more recommendations you'll get, the more aware you will be of what's out there and available. And the second piece of advice I would offer is publish. Do your best to write and try to get your writing published in reputable publications. The more that you do that, the more you will establish your bona fides, the more you will be recognized as a player in the field, the more attractive you'll be to prospective employers.
Well, that's all the time we have. George Beebe, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us. Thank you to all of you in our audience for listening in. We will be back in 2 weeks to hear about Iran with Negar Mortazavi. Everybody have a wonderful evening.